So welcome everyone to attend the third ComSoc ISAC webinar series, the third season. And this season we have invited the 6 world-class speakers working in the relevant area of radar sensing and wireless communication. They will share their opinions and recent research progress on this topic. And today we are very fortunate and honored to have Professor Moeness Amin, the world-class radar expert, to give us a talk. So I will hand over to Professor Sharon Wang to introduce the biography of Professor Amin.
Okay.
Sharon,
hello.
please.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Liu. So hello, everyone. Please allow me to give a short introduction of Professor Moeness Amin. So Professor Moeness Amin received a PhD degree from the University of Colorado, Boulder in 1984. Since 1985, he has been with the Villanova University, Villanova in Pennsylvania, in the United States, where he became the director of the Center for Advanced Communications in 2002. Dr. Amin is a life fellow of the IEEE, fellow of the International Society of Optical Engineering, fellow of the Institute of Engineering and Technology, and a fellow of the European Association for Signal Processing. He is the recipient of the 2022 IEEE Dennis Picard Gold Medal in Radar Technologies and Applications. So 2017 Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Advanced Science and Technology, and the 2016 Alexander von Humboldt Research Award, and the 2016 IET Achievement Medal. The 2014 IEEE Signal Processing Society Technical Achievement Award, the 2009 Technical Achievement Award from the European Association for Signal Processing, the 2015 IEEE Aerospace and Electronic Systems Society R&D White Award for Excellence in Radar Engineering. He is also the recipient of the IEEE Third Millennium Medal. So Dr. Amin served as the chair and member of the electrical cluster of Franklin Institute Committee on Science and Arts from 2001 to 2016. He currently serves on the editorial board of the Proceedings of the IEEE. Dr. Amin is the editor of 3 books on radar. So I actually know Dr. Amin for a long time, and he's my postdoc supervisor. And we have kept a close research collaboration since then. The reason is that you can always learn new things from Dr. Amin. So, so before I give this virtual state to Dr. Amin to give his talk, I will briefly introduce this Q&A rules. So all audiences will be muted during the seminar, and please do not annotate on your screen. Otherwise, other people also will see your notes. And you can type your question and send the questions to me or to Professor Liu or Professor Cui, so to the host or co-host. And at the end of the talk, we will collect questions from both audiences, from Zoom and offsite live broadcast. During the Q&A, we will choose 3 to 5 questions to ask the speaker. And the questioners will be named, and you will be unmuted, and you can ask the question by yourself. Okay, now let's welcome Dr. Amin's talk entitled Dual Function System with Legacy Radar Platform. Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing. Is this one? No. Can you share now?
Yes.
Okay.
Right here. Can you see it?
Yes. Great.
Okay, very good. Okay, well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depends where you are. First, let me thank Dr. Fan Lu for presiding over this series. I certainly would like to thank Dr. Shanrong Wang for inviting me. Just before we went live, we were talking about the challenges of going in the third round all the good things that I wanted to talk about already been addressed by the former speakers. So I will try to talk about something a little bit relatively different in some sense. So basically more conceptual than analytical, in the hope that will generate maybe new ideas for the audience or the people who are gonna listen to this recording afterwards. So the kind of the underpinning motivation for my talk today is to look into maybe a different angle from many of the talks before me. So the prime motivations in designing dual function system with legacy radar platforms is to share the valuable spectrum to avoid RF congestion and reduce the demand on bandwidth. That's very common to everybody in this area. But we also would like to achieve low probability of intercept or even steganography for communications. And use the radar if the communication system is broken, compromised, destroyed, or becomes available. So the only means you have to communicate is through your radar system. That's probably more protected than the communications in many cases. Again, before we went live, we were talking with Professor Liu and Professor Wang about how they got into this area. And let me just spend maybe a few seconds telling you how I got in this area, right? So we'll talk about legacy radar platforms. So radar basically is the host and communications is the guest. That's how I look at it. So the legacy would be the radar waveform and radar beam that we're going to talk about today. So in 2010, I really became aware of this area by the paper by Dr. Blunt and his co-authors on embedding information into radar emissions via waveform implementation. And then I didn't really get into this area until 2014, where I attended the IEEE International Conference in Lille, France, and I listened to a paper by Izure and his co-authors titled Dual Function Radar Communication Time Modulated Array. So I remember vividly coming back from this conference and meeting with then my three research professors, Dr. Fawzi Ahmad, Dr. Eamon Zhang, and Dr. Nasr Hassanein. And the three being much smarter than I am, we sat down and they charted the course of research that expanded on this 2014 paper. And we all benefited from the leadership of Professor Hassanein at that time, who pushed the things forward. So if we look at the applications that kind of motivated us at that time and the years afterwards, is certainly the automotive radar, where the radar becomes the means to communicate without a designated communication link between the vehicles. Also in telemetry, tracking and communications, you can have the radar tracking an aircraft and also communicating with the pilot without a designated communication link. And we can also see in this scenario where there is a master and slave radars, where the master radar gathers information about the target and communicates this information to the slave radar without the communication link, right? And not only communicating the target information, but can also communicate scheduling information about what the radar going to be using next in terms of the bandwidth, waveform, the beam, and so forth, so on. So if you take a look at this one, I kind of expand it a little bit. So operations in restricted electromagnetic emissions control environment, that's also important. It allows operating in an LPI radar system while relaying track data to friendly units without the requirements of establishing a separate dedicated communication link that may expose platforms to passive detection by adversaries. So if we take a look at, if we're going to use the radar to communicate, so we have to understand the radar parameters that can be employed to communicate. So basically the radar transmits a stream of pulses of high power, large bandwidth in a beam, right? And then it receives what it transmitted, and it operates on this received signal in a coherent processing interval, and it's allowed to measure the time delay, which basically gives you the range and the target velocity from the CPI. And certainly it moves the beam such as that it tracks targets, right? So these are the parameters that the radar possesses. Now the question is, how would you embed the communication messages or communications constellation, right? And in the radar parameter, certainly you can embed that in the radar beam, or you can embed it in fast time, or you can embed it in slow time. There is nothing else really. We can look at polarization maybe, right? So that's how the field actually took off. So some radar parameters, when they are used to communicate, they may change slightly. Some others may be kept intact, right? But at the end of the day, we introduce this notion that the radar becomes the system of opportunity, right? So whether the communication uses the slow time or fast time or the beam, it's using the radar legacy platforms, right? So this is what we started, and we kept going on it for a few years. So what forms of signal embedding? Now, signal embedding, again, is you are taking the communication messages and trying to use the radar parameters to transmit these messages to friendly users, right? So you can alter the radar pulse. Alter the radar pulse, that doesn't mean change it. Alter meaning that multiplying it by a complex scalar, like a phase, for example, right? So you take your symbol phase and multiply it by the pulse, right? So that we call it scale, right? That's how you do it, right? Now, change is different. Change basically is you change the entire radar pulse from one pulse repetition interval to the next, right? We call that coding, right? Then you can alter the radar pulse over fast time. So basically you get your symbol data stream and multiply that by the radar pulse. So actually it's waveform modulation. That's different from scaling, and certainly different from the coding. Then you can use the radar beam, right? So you can change the radar beam from one pulse repetition interval to the next based on the communication message, right? We call that beam modulation. Then if you have a MIMO system, you can shuffle the orthogonal waveforms across the array, meaning that you can change the pairing between the antenna and the waveform for different symbols. So different symbols will have different pairings, right? Some people call that index modulation. Also, index modulation covers the selecting the transmit antennas over slow time, meaning that every time you get a symbol, you designate a subarray of your full array to transmit the signal. Of course, the subarray doesn't have to be uniformly spaced, so it can be a sparse array. That's also a form of index modulation. So if you focus on the beam modulation, right? So basically you have a target, and certainly you design a designated beam for that, right? And then what's left is the side lobes. So you cannot really compromise the main beam, right? You cannot compromise its shape, or you cannot compromise its power, right? So the only thing left is to communicate the user messages to the user through the side lobes. So that's the first thing we looked at, right? So if you take a look at the beam modulation, right? So basically you designate along the user position, you designate or you design different beams which coincide pretty well at the main beam, but they differ in the side lobe levels depending on the messages that you would like to send. So here I'm sending 4 messages or 4 symbols, right? So I can design the beam with 4 different side lobe levels towards the user position, right? So design several beams with the same main beam and different side lobe levels at user angle, right? So in this case, the beam is the information bearing entity, right? So that is how you transmit, right? And maybe called the beam index modulation or the beam signal embedding. So in this case, switching beams is as fast as the pulse repetition frequency. So every pulse repetition frequency, I send a different beam where the side lobe level is different depending on the transmitted symbol. Now, something that I think everybody should take notice of is that if you have a bit stream, communication bit stream, and you would like a certain constellation, binary phase shift keying and all the things, right? And you would like to send that by the radar, right? Really, the signal modulation to beam modulation may not assume the same values or structures. For example, right, if the intended modulation is binary phase shift keying, right, is PSK, right? So you have 4 different constellation points, and you would like to send that through the beam, for example, right? So you still can not necessarily send those magnitude and phase or amplitude and phase through the beam. You can go back and send those 4 different constellation points into 4 different side lobe levels. So there is no one-to-one. Nobody's forcing you to design the beam such as that this constellation point is transmitted. We're going to visit that in a few minutes to draw a contrast between the communication society and the radar society in the way they look at this problem, right? So, for example, as I said, if this is a constellation of choice or the modulation of choice, you can map this point to this side lobe level and this point to this lobe level and so forth and so on. So this is a final decider. You can choose any constellation you want, but at the end of the day, you have to design the beam the way you like, right? So there is no phases here, right? I mapped the different phases of amplitude to 4 different amplitudes, right? Of course, you can use convex optimization to design those 4 beams. You can see they are very much the same at the radar main beam. The same thing, by the way, this one here is a wide band, broad beam. Here is a narrow beam. You can also map these things right there, right? So how you decide about the changes that you need to make in the side lobe levels to accommodate the different constellation points, that's your choice, but doesn't have to be one-to-one. That means mapping the phase to a phase, mapping the amplitude to amplitude. Right? It's the same thing, by the way, for designing different side lobe levels with different phases. So now I can, for example, get those 4 constellation points into 4 different phases. Right? So in this case, I can design the phases to coincide with those 4 phases. So at the very end is how you design the beamformer to accommodate the constellation of choice. So in the case of multiple access information delivery, right now I have multiple users. Each one has its own messages. Now, if all the users share the same messages, it becomes broadcasting, right? It's the same thing. But now if I have multiple users, for example, 2, now instead, and suppose that each user gets like 2 levels, like it has a constellation of binary phase shift keying, not QPSK, binary phase shift keying. Now I have, instead of having 2 beams for 1 and 0, for example, I have 4 beams because these 2 users receive independent messages. So now my job is a little bit more challenging. Now I have to design different beams because, or many more beams, because I have more than 1 user, right? And through this design, I have to maintain the main beam invariant with the messages I'm sending, right? So the number of beams increases with the number of users unless it's broadcasting. So now, if you look at what you are doing, the radar community, right, they are sending different information to different users in different directions. Now, the COM society is also talking the same language, right, but they call it directional modulation, right? It's an important area in the COM society. Now, I feel personally that those two efforts are not bridged in the way they should be, right? And that's what I wanted to kind of spend a few minutes on this similarities and differences between those two. So in direction modulation, in a multi-beam transmission scenario, direction modulation can be used to give us the freedom to securely transmit multiple signals and messages in various directions. Direction modulation is able to use multi-beam transmission to transmit multiple signals in different spatial directions, send multiple communication messages to multiple receivers, secure communication signals sent in a hostile environment. Isn't that exactly what side lobe embedding is, right? But in the direction modulation, when the COM society talks about it, right, I mean, there is no target, right? So basically, to try for those different users to send different beams, each beam has to deliver the messages for that designated user, right? So direction modulation is a physical layer security technique that communicates the symbols to designated users through the manipulation of the beamforming weights. It provides a high degree of secrecy, right? But how they do that? Well, every time there is a set of messages to be sent to those users, they design the beam weights, right? So the next time around to transmit is a different set of beam weights. Well, that's exactly what we are doing in side lobe embedding. You know, every pulse repetition period, we're changing the beam weights. Otherwise, how do you think we get the 4 different or the different side lobe levels, right? It is the weights. So it's the same thing, but in the direction modulation, you say, well, in this transmission period, give me the messages that you want to send to the different users, right? So this R is a message or symbol vector, right? And H will be, if you will, the channel matrix or the steering matrix, which defines the steering vectors where the users are, right? So you have H and then you have R, then you wonder what kind of weight, beamformer weight you want to choose. You can solve that certainly using least squares, and that will guarantee that each user gets the designated message, like user 1 gets M1, user 2 gets M2, right? So this is, you know, in simple ways how we describe direction modulation. Of course, there are more sophisticated methods that takes this idea forward, but that in principle, that's what they are doing, right? Now, if I want to take the direction modulation in the COM society, right, and trying to move it closer to the radar society, I can say, wait a minute, that user number 3, how about if I make it a target, right? So now I take this one and I say, this is now my target. And I use the same matrix vector representation and I solve for the weights, right? But how can I make it a target? You can say, you know, you can go to your symbol vector, where this message, maybe M3, right? Put a very high value, such that the least square solution of the weights will recognize that it needs to form a strong beam towards that direction. That's one way to take the fundamentals of direction modulation and trying to steer it towards the radar application. But in this case, when you solve for the weights, you know, you have no control over the radar beam. I mean, you are under the mercy of the least square solutions, right? Because you're one of the players. Other players are the communication users, right? So, and then the radar does not become the legacy system, right? So in this case, you have no control over the beam width or the side lobe levels of the radar beam, right? Which is paramount in the radar application, right? So if you take a look at the two areas. So that's on the left, that will be direction modulation. That's basically in the COMS society. On the right, that will be the radar community, right? Where you have a strong beam towards the target that you cannot typically compromise or significantly alter. And then you would like to accommodate the communication users, and you can say, well, be my guest as long as you don't compromise my beam. So I can use my side lobes as a radar system and communicate those messages to the designated user. So I maintain that the direction modulation and side lobe embedding is two sides of the same coin. It's just depending on your preference and application. And also, you can see that the two communities also pursuing the eavesdropper. For example, on the left, that was extracted from published work. You can see now that I'm sending, this is my user, and this will be the probability of error if for other angles. That means if an eavesdropper exists, it's not gonna get a good BER, right? And people try to make that line very flat, as you can see from the red here, right? The same thing that on the right, that also extracted from the COMS society. They say, well, here are the two users. This is the BER where they are, and then we would like to make that direction modulation very robust to eavesdropper intrusion, right? So the two communities also look at the eavesdropper and try to make sure that it does not listen to the messages. But when I thought about this a little bit, actually just a few days ago, I said, well, wait a minute. So let us think about the eavesdropper a little bit more, right? For those direction modulation and side lobe embedding. So in direction modulation, right? Suppose you have a constellation. A very simple matter is just amplitude shift keying, right? So simple, very simple, right? That's one user, right? So suppose you have only one user, right? So if you solve this least squares, right, you're gonna get a beam towards the user, right? And you're gonna get the side lobes. Right? So if you have eavesdropper now, right? So the eavesdropper, because of the lower signal to noise ratio, is gonna receive the same modulation, the same structure, right? But it's gonna be kind of compressed because the signal is not that strong, right? So depending where it's listening on the high side lobe or in a null or so, you're gonna get the green or the black. But at the end of the day, the eavesdropper receives the same modulation structure as the intended user. It's just, a kind of attenuated further, if you will. Now, if you take a look at the eavesdropper in the side lobe embedding in the radar community, right? So here is the user, right? And you have 4 different, right? Now, this eavesdropper, it does not receive the same side lobe level structure, attenuated. Absolutely not, right? In fact, these levels at the eavesdropper do not exist, and if they do, they are shuffled. For example, when you design, you're under the mercy of your beamformer design. For example, this low side lobe can be the highest here, depending on how the beam is being designed. So if you take a look at, this will be the intended user, for example, right? So you design this, let's say this is equally separated. So you can get the equal separation, right? But right here at this point, the constellation has shrunk, right? So it's not the signal to noise ratio like in direction modulation that the constellation gets compressed. No, I lost the structure, right? And if you go to eavesdropper here, right, it's not as closely spaced at this side lobe peak, right? But it's going to be attenuated, which means the following, which means that the eavesdropper does not receive the same intended constellation as the user, right? And the eavesdropper has to now apply maximum likelihood and trying to put the thresholds and so forth, so on, right? And in fact, if I know where the eavesdropper is, I can design the beam. You can see here that these are the eavesdropper. I can make those beams completely exact, right? Look at this, coincide very well at the eavesdropper location, such as that the eavesdropper, no matter what side lobe levels I am sending, is going to get the same value. So now the constellation that's received by this eavesdropper is, the constellation points are so close, that means the probability of error will be higher. In the case of embedding phase shift keying, right? Now this is also very interesting. So for the direction modulation, right? Suppose I do the QPSK, right? The eavesdropper gets, as we said, attenuated version of that. But if you take a look at the side lobe embedding in the radar community, right? Now, the eavesdropper will not get that structure. It's going to get actually a destroyed structure depending on the beam design at its angle, how those, for example, 4 beams behave at the angles. And in fact, not only the constellation points get closer to each other, the swath of the angle, right, may not be 2 pi, right? So depending on how the beam behaves at the eavesdropper, I may not get the this regular separation, right? That's kind of pi by 2 type of things, right? If you go to a higher order constellation, right? So again, in direction modulation gets an attenuated version of it, but take a look at the side lobe embedding, right? These are possible side lobe levels or constellation points at the eavesdropper. The structure is completely gone, right? And the eavesdropper has to find out what every side lobe level, right, and every phase corresponds to, make, one-to-one correspondence, and that's not easy. In fact, it becomes the contrast between the direction modulation and side lobe embedding becomes a little bit more pronounced if you have multiple users. So in the direction modulation, if you have multiple users, the eavesdropper will get the combined constellation of the two. So if this is QPSK, this is QPSK is going to get, 16 constellation points, right? So in side lobe embedding, also I'm going to get 16 beams, right? But the 16 beams, it's very difficult from the 16 beams to say, well, those 4 corresponds to this, those 4 corresponds to that. Because again, the contribution of those side lobe levels to the eavesdropper will not have the same structure, will not have the same relative differences or even order, right? So I think the finding the probability of error at the eavesdropper and side lobe embedding needs a little bit further investigation and cannot assume the same conditions at those provided in the direction modulation. So I believe this is very important because now we have 16 beams, right? So the side lobe, side lobe, the eavesdropper needs to discern, what is going on, right? Which beams correspond to this user, because I want to eavesdrop on that user 1. So I have to decide which beams correspond to user 1, which beam correspond to user 2, and that is much more difficult to do than the eavesdropper discerning which constellation belong to user 1, which constellation belong to user 2. So that's the first topic I want to talk about. The second one is the waveform diversity, right? So if you take a look at what is available to the radar, so the radar certainly can change its waveform from one pulse repetition interval to the next, right? I mean, in the simplest way, you can have up chirp and down chirp. You can certainly use a phase-coded signal as a source of diversity, right? In this case, they design a phase-coded sequence, and there are many ways you can do that. The technical report in MITRE by Fonte is very important, and that actually got me in this area many years ago. Right. Of course, this one will give you a low probability of intercept. When you design this phase-coded signal, there are two things that you would like to look at: is maximizing the peak to side lobe ratio. That's basically in terms of the range resolution and range side lobes, and then maximizing isolation. Maximizing isolation, that's also important in the communication embedding. Why? Because, you know, if you change the waveform from one pulse repetition period to the next, right, your communication receiver, it has knowledge of all different waveforms, and it has to apply match filter, right, to find out which waveform the radar transmits, right? So the maximizing isolation somehow lesser the confusion of the communication receiver to discern which waveform that the radar is, you know, is transmitting. So that's important. That's a cross correlation between two waveforms in this orthogonal waveform set. So if you take a look at the rising chirp and falling chirp, for example, right? So if you take a look, we have a chirp of 10 microseconds and bandwidth of 1 megahertz. That's what you get in the autocorrelation for the chirp. And in the red, you get the isolation. That's a cross correlation. Now, if you go from 1 megahertz to 100 megahertz, now take a look at that. Certainly, you get improvement in the self-correlation, right? And then the cross-correlation with isolation is really very low. So we say that you are better off using a higher time bandwidth product, right? So this one has a higher bandwidth product, time bandwidth product compared to this one, right? So of course you can make things longer, you can make with wider band. So that is the chirp, which is the simplest way of waveform diversity. If you go to the Kasami code and you take a look at the properties, again, that will be, the red will be the self-correlation, and the blue will be the isolation. You can see here, it's very, very small, right? And again, if you increase the number of chips, you get a much better picture. This is this is our slices in the ambiguity function. That A will give you the zero delay cut and B will give you the zero Doppler cut. So they are, of course, very powerful sequences, right? Now, if you have the waveform diversity, what you're going to do with it? You can go back to the side lobe embedding and say, listen, right? Not only I'm going to use those 4 different levels, you know, I'm going to exploit the orthogonality of waveforms, right? So now, let's go back here. So now instead of having 4 different beams, I can have only 2 beams, but I need to seek the help of orthogonal waveform. So this 2 constellation point, I'm going to send them with 1 orthogonal waveform, right, with 2 different levels. And these 2 constellation points, I'm going to send it with another waveform, right, with the same 2 different side lobe levels. So I cut down on the number of side lobe levels. So I traded the side lobe levels with the orthogonal waveforms. Certainly now you can expand on this if you have a larger number of orthogonal waveforms. So you can cut down on the number of beams that you need to design. But in this case, from the eavesdropper point of view, right, the eavesdropper not only has to discern about the constellation that is translated into different side lobe levels, it has to find out what the orthogonal waveforms are, right? So the better job you design in making this waveform a kind of low probability of intercept, the better off you are in terms of the eavesdropper, right? So this is one way to use the orthogonal waveforms in conjunction with the side lobe embedding. Another way to do it is just on its own. Forget about embedding in the beam, right? So basically, you use it such as that different symbols will be represented by different waveforms, right? So this, we call it the coding. So we go from beam modulation to the coding, right? And we focus on the radar network, as I mentioned, the abstract. right? So in this case, right, the communication signal embedding in the radar waveform is for the sole purpose of assisting and enhancing the radar network functionality. So I don't have independent users that receive independent messages. No, my users are other units in my radar network. So this will be the user, right? So I'm trying to communicate what I learned as a master radar unit from the target sensing, right? And communicate that to another member of the network units, right? So in this case, the communication messages are radar data, right? Not completely different, not speech, right? So I call that auto-embedding or self-embedding, right? So the principal feature defines specific class of dual function system in which communications is an integral part of the radar, cannot do without it, right? And is considered essential for a successful execution and completion, right? So communication signal is radar data in this case, right? So what I would like to send to the other members in the radar network, I want to send as a master radar, I want to send the target information where the target is, range and Doppler and angle and other information about the target, as well as the scheduling information, because radar changes its parameters every CPI. The sophisticated radar can change the pulse repetition interval, it can change many things, right? So I would like the other units in the radar network to be aware of what parameters I'm using, right, as a master unit. So scheduling data as well as radar data are important, right? The scheduling data specifically certainly is target data is very rich, right? Look, depending on what you want to send. You want to send the range Doppler map, or you're going to send the generalized likelihood ratio, or whatever it is, right, that you would like to send to the others to benefit from it. But very important is that whatever you are sending, right, the information changes from CPI to CPI. So whatever you are sending must be completed before the next CPI. So if you're gonna take this information, translate it into bits, and then or symbols, and send those symbols in one pulse repetition interval, that's fine. But be aware that if you would like to include error correction coding or any type of coding that will entail additional bits, those bits as well as the original bits have to be transmitted and concluded before the next pulse repetition interval. So just give you an example. Suppose the radar has different parameter values for different entities. The carrier frequency can choose one of those four. Bandwidth can choose one of those two, right? So that is the master radar, right? It can change its parameters, right? It picks one of those four, right? Direction, beam direction, pick one of those four, right? So what it's going to do is they're going to say, well, you know, I'm going to send now, suppose I pick this one that's out of four. That's a dictionary of the carrier frequency, or four possibilities, right? So I encode that in 2 bits. Now the bandwidth, I can use this or that, right? So I encode that. I want to send this information to the other units in the network, right? So now I have 2 bits, 1 bit, 2 bits, 1 bit, and 2 bits. So in total is 8 bits, right? So those bits now I'm going to pick for just for simplicity, up and down chirp, right? So 1 is up, 0 is down. So this information here will be requiring 2 bits to be transmitted. This 1 bit, this is 2 bits, right? Now, also I would like to make sure to reduce the probability of error. So I put some coding in it, and again, for the sake of low probability to intercept. But whatever coding I'm doing, this additional bits with the original, whether you are shuffling them or interleaving them, they have to conclude before the next CPI starts, because the next CPI will have different values for scheduling information, right? So this is one strategy. The other strategies, the first strategy is take each information parameter and encode it separately, right? So take this one, 2, this one, you know, in sequence. The other one is say, listen, you know, I'm going to choose this bandwidth waveform, this waveform, this bandwidth, this PRR, right? This combination, I'm going to make it a symbol. Then I'm going to code the symbols into bits, right? Again, you can also end up, in fact, with the same 8 bits to encode this information. But this has advantage. Why? Because certain combination may not be desirable. So you cannot mix this waveform, for example, with this bandwidth. It's not good. So that combination is out. When this combination is out, that means the number of possible symbols gets reduced. Another thing, by the way, if it is not a power of 2, like I suppose I have 3, right? 3. In this case, you can show mathematically that strategy 2, when basically you look at the combined values and designate symbols, is better than strategy 1 when you encode each one separately. The advocates of strategy 1, though, they say, listen, in strategy 1, if this guy is in error, right, it does not affect the other scheduling parameters. They would be received intact. The answer for that is that, listen, if one in error, the rest are bad, whether they are received correct or not, because they all have to function together. And then also in any type of coding you are putting, you're going to mix those things anyhow, right? So if this is an error, it's going to propagate in all. Right, so that's why to do it. Now, if you take a look again in this specific application, right, the slave that's receiving this information, right, those up and down chirps, right, first of all, it has to know that the master sent this information, so it has to detect that chirp. Then it needs to classify it. Is it up or down chirp? Of course, I'm focusing on chirps as a kind of a simple example. You can extend that to phase-coded signal, right? So if you take a look at, again, for the chirp, you have up, down, up chirp and down chirp. If you take a look at the isolation, is important for the classification, right? Isolation is important for classification, right? So you take a look at the cross correlation that's given by the Fresnel function defined as such, right? T is the certainly is the span of the pulse, right? And we showed you the isolation and the autocorrelation in terms of the chirp. So now the slave that's receiving this information has to detect the presence of the chirp, because the target can change. Staggering pulse repetition interval can change actually when it sends the waveform, right? So it has to detect, then it has to classify. So if you go through the equations, and this is just 1 or 2 slides. So basically, now you have the up chirp with SU, you have down chirp SD. So at the receiver, you apply 2 match filter, 1 for the up, 1 for the down, and decide taking the power, right? That's how the radar operates. So, different than communications, right? You take the power, you compare the power coming out of that. And if it is less than a threshold, you say, this is a down chirp, this, up, you say it's an up chirp. It's not easy, by the way, to find an expression for that, because YU appears up and down. That's data received, right? But if you do the derivations, actually you put that in the this paper that's submitted recently, you can show that the probability of error is given by this expression, where the F denotes the Gauss hypergeometric function. By the way, this series converges pretty fast, right? So maybe 4 or 5 terms, and that's it, right? And this is the definition of this parameter. So if you take a look at the probability of error, something also very interesting but expected, right, is that how the probability of error depends on the time bandwidth product of the chirp. You can see here that this probability of error benefits from higher time bandwidth product, because higher time bandwidth product, as we saw from the figure, shows you better isolation between the up chirp and down chirp. So I benefit from better isolation by making less error in classification. And that's shown here by the dotted versus the strong. If you do the multiplication, this is higher time frequency bandwidth product than this one, right? If you go to probability of detection, right, So again, you compare the power coming out of one match filter, right, with the threshold, and the other one like this, right? That if you are doing the correct classification, if you are doing the misclassification, then basically the power, if you have up chirp and somehow you classify the down chirp to the power coming out of the down chirp will be the one compared to the threshold. Of course, you wanted this to be invariant with the classification. So if you combine the two, it will be the maximum of the two outputs compared to the threshold. Now, if you want to combine L of those pulses, you can sum of that. Again, the probability of detection. So given by this expression, you will need certainly to find what is the threshold for the Neiman person detector. You come in with a defined false alarm probability, that's PF. You can also derive the expression for the false alarm probability, and you can get the threshold according to the specified PF. And if you go through the derivation of the probability of detection, you can simplify it to be in terms of the Q function. These parameters are also given in this paper, right? So, but what I want to point out to you, something also very interesting, right? Now I'm plotting the probability of detection versus SNR for different number of pulses that I'm combining, right? Certainly, when I combine more pulses, the probability of detection will improve. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in this curve. In this curve, it shows you that the probability of detection suffers more from a higher bandwidth product. So time bandwidth product. So wait a minute. We showed that the probability of error benefits from higher isolation, which associated with higher time bandwidth product. On the contrary, right, the probability of detection suffers because you want to detect the presence of the pulse, right? So you don't care about the isolation. In fact, you don't want to have very high isolation, right? So we say the following, that detection performance improves when the time frequency product decreases, right? Which causes less signal isolation. Both match filter output will indicate increased probability of presence of the target reflected signal. On the other hand, the BER improves when time bandwidth product decreases, right? There should be, time frequency increases, right? Due to the increase in signal isolation, should be increases. Higher signal isolation is better for performance in terms of bit error, but bad for detection performance. So this interplay between the probability of error and probability of detection as a function of the time bandwidth product, I think it's very interesting, and it is specific to this problem, where now the user is no longer a communication user. It is actually another unit in the radar network that it has to discern about whether the pulse exists or not, and if it exists, when, and when, what it is. Right. I see we're getting very close to the end, but I just wanted to show you again, just to continue on for this up and down chirp. This is, by the way, looking into cut in the ambiguity function. You can see, for example, that when you have up and down chirps and it's random, you can see that the zero Doppler cut for up and down chirp is better than the zero Doppler cut when you only send up chirps, or you only send down chirps, because the randomness here takes away from the coherence when you do the correlation using 20 chirps. But you can show that in the zero range cut, the Doppler behavior is the same. So I'm not going to cover the frequency hop because of the time, but I will end here, and I thank you for listening.
Okay, so many thanks, Professor Amin, for your wonderful talk. And I think we have a couple of questions regarding your talk. So the first question is from Wei Tong Zhai. So Wei Tong, can you please unmute yourself and you can ask the question, please.
Yes, thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
do.
we
Yeah,
can
go
hear
ahead.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, good morning, Professor Amin. I have a small question. As mentioned in the lecture, that the side lobe embedding is secure against the eavesdroppers. But is there a problem that when the communication user is not located exactly at the assumed location, which means that maybe 0.5 degrees amplification, maybe in this case, the communication users will not receive any information at all. So in this case, should we consider the robustness issue of the communications?
Yes, absolutely. And this actually kind of variance of the design depending on the accuracy of the prior knowledge of where, especially, by the way, I mean, your question is right on target because the communication user could be on the move. It may not be actually on a standstill, right? So you can design the beam just like, you know, in one of the slides, I showed a very broad beam for the target. You can make that null flatter a little bit. When you go to the side lobes, right? So you can make that one a little flat, depending, of course, on the number of degrees of freedom. And your question brings a very important point because in the radar community that makes sure that the beam is intact for the target, it has fewer degrees of freedom when compared to the COM society, right? Because you want to maintain the radar beam intact, right? But if there are many sensors that will give you additional degrees of freedom, many antennas, right? You can certainly accommodate for the inaccuracy of the user position. By the way, the reason we put a flat beam to start with for the radar, because again, we may not know exactly where the target is, so we'd like to make sure that we don't miss. So it's the same concept, but you're right. Depending on degrees of freedom, you can design the beam accordingly. But by the way, this is the same issue in directional modulation, right? In directional modulation, if the user is not exactly where it is presented by this steering vector, and by the way, this steering vector can be replaced by the channel H in general. So if you are wrong in the channel, you're going to be sending that beam somewhere else, right? Not where the user is, right? So it's the same problem, whether from the COM society or from the side lobe embedding in the radar community.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks a lot, Wei Tong and Professor Amin. So following Wei Tong's question, I also have a question regarding this eavesdropper scenario. So what if the target itself is an eavesdropper? For example, this kind of scenario, I think is quite typical in the military scenarios. Well, you're detecting like aircraft, right? And you are using dual functional signals. So in that case, is it possible that your information will be leaked or not leaked because you are directly illuminated that target using your main beam?
Yes.
So is it possible to have your information eavesdropped by a target?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, you know, the worst case for the eavesdropper to be the target because we make sure that the tip of the beam, right, is fixed no matter what, right? So the design doctrine and this side lobe embedding is to make sure that the beam, because you don't want to have beam modulation at the target, right? So you want to make sure that that tip of the beam has the same phase and has the same amplitude as much as possible, right? So while the side lobes is varying, communicating the information to the user, if actually the eavesdropper is the pilot in a target that I am tracking, for example, right? You want to make sure that this is the things. The example that I showed in terms of telemetry and things like this may be a little bit confusing, right? So in this case, deliberately, if we know that we would like to communicate, that's different than the eavesdropper being the pilot. But if the pilot is a friendly user, right, I would like to communicate to him, we can afford making the main beam as a communication bearing medium, right? But apart of that, your question really, it actually opens up a very interesting things is where and when you modulate the main beam or you leave it alone. So in this case, I think you should just leave it alone with very, very minimum variation, such as that, you know, the beam is intact.
Okay, thanks. So I think we got another question from Xiangrong. So can you please ask the question?
Yeah, it's a very excellent talk, Dr. Amin. So I just wondering, like, I know for communication societies, like multipass and intersymbol interference are very big concerns for these communication guides. So like when we do communication embedding into the radar, it seems like we never consider this problem, like intersymbol interference and like this multipass effect. Do you think we should consider these problems which that communication people are very concerned about? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. You know, whatever techniques are used in a conventional communication can also be used in the side lobe embedding, including, by the way, the coding, including all these other things, right, and synchronization and so forth, so on, right. The idea here is that, you know, the channel, right? So, for example, right, when you say, well, I'm gonna send, change the side lobe levels in the direction of the user, right? So the direction of the user is defined by a bearing, by an angle, right?
Yeah.
That's the same thing in the directional modulation when you say that steering matrix is defined by the steering vectors. But, you know, the question here is what should be done if the user is not in the line of sight, right? Suppose it is hidden behind a building that, for example, the only way you can get it through multipass and things. So the question here, should we look into the same thing in directional modulation where the replace that matrix, steering matrix, by that channel matrix? Can we do the same thing for the side lobe embedding? So I think that certainly is doable.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay, so we got a final question, I think. So the time is already up, and actually, so like I said in the beginning, Professor Amin, I read lots of your paper during my PhD. So actually, your paper guided me into this area. So recently, we are thinking about this. So I think what you are proposing is basically radar-centric signaling strategy, right? So you're trying to embed information in the radar waveform, and then there's another signaling strategy is communication-centric. So you want to have your communication functionality to be the primary function, right? And you can somehow to have a sensing ability for your signals. I'm wondering, is there some essential trade-off between them? Because it seems to me that in your waveform design, you're trying to keep the integrity of your radar pulse by, you know, embed as much as possible information, communication information in that, by all those, you know, modulating all those parameters. So I'm wondering, can we see that, for example, the trade-off between communication and sensing, or between radar and communication, is some sort of deterministic signal versus random signals? Because for communication, you want to transmit as much information as possible, which means that you should transmit you know, as random as possible signal that you have. But this randomness will definitely break the structure of your radar pulses. So you somehow want to reduce this randomness, right? But when you increase that, you may somehow damage your radar performance. So I think there's some interesting trade-off in them.
Yeah, so again, you mentioned radar-centric and communication-centric. We used in the early days, we used to call dual function, R before C or C before R, radar communication or communication radar, and that's how we define who's more important, and who's the host and who's the guest, right? So in using the legacy radar platforms, the idea here is that, when you talk about radar, is it basically an indoor radar, or is it an urban radar, or is it a radar in the battlefield? I mean, you have to distinguish that, and accordingly, you can compromise and you can trade off, and you can say, well, now I have a dual function. Who's the primary, who's the secondary, who can afford losing a little bit here, or who cannot afford, right? So when we looked into the radar centric, as you mentioned, or look at the legacy radar platforms, we didn't think about looking in this conference room and putting the radar here, right, and communications. No, I mean, the applications would certainly a little bit, I mean, it's known, right? I mean, there's applications. So in this respect, the radar, sends very, very high power. It's very, very bad, high bandwidth, and it's a critical technology. The radar community, the radar people may not really like to share and compromise and all things. So the question here: how can we do our best to keep them happy, right? At the same time, benefit from the radar resources and so forth, so on. Now, if you're telling me that you are using the radar indoor, right here in this conference room, right, and then you want to have the beam and you cannot, compromise, you cannot, that I tell you that that's not where it belongs, right? Okay, so that trade-off, as you mentioned, is a great question. The trade-off between radar communication is application specific, is application dependent, right? So in many papers I read in this area, I wanted to see in the abstract, in the introduction. Unfortunately, I don't see that, right? Where the application is very specified, right? In automotive, people say the automotive things, right? But you say now we have an integrated sensing and communication. Where are you using this one, right? Because every application demands specific attributes, and sometimes are not ready to compromise. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, very good answer.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Amin. So I guess we do not have any remaining questions for now. And with that, I would like to thank Professor Amin for his wonderful talk and for being here as our guest speaker. And we wish to see you in our future events. Okay, so with that, thanks Professor Amin again.
Thank you, and thank Dr. Wang. And I see very heavy weights here attending the talk. So I thank everybody here, whether heavyweight or lightweight, senior or junior, and I hope they benefited from some of these ideas that I intended to communicate. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Okay, have a good day, Professor Amin.
Thank you.
Goodbye.